Holy shit. We all knew we'd get new footage during State of Play, but I don't think any one of us expected this. Hey stragglers and tourists, my name is TheiPadCat. There is so much stuff here. All of it amazing, and I'm ready to dig deep into all of it, break it down and analyze it. But before we begin, I just want to say a massive thanks to my subscribers and members of my Discord for helping me pointing out a lot of the things I talk about here today. If you'd like to join the server, there's a link in the description down below. Also, this is gonna be a long one, but I think you knew that already. Anyways, me, you, and the entirety of the TLU fanbase have been waiting way too long for this. So, I think it's time we
get on with it.
Alright. Unlike my breakdown of the E3 2018 demo, I'll go through this trailer shot for shot, pointing out and talking about everything in them, and once I've gone through the entire trailer, I'll give my thoughts and theories on general story stuff, trying to piece together as much of it as I can. So, the trailer opens with this shot of Jackson during wintertime whilst Dina asks Ellie to rate their kiss from presumably the party that was shown in the E3 2018 demo in the background. Now, what I find interesting about this shot, other than the fact that it's a beautiful scene, is that The Last of Us Part 1 rarely, if ever, had these landscape shots other than when Joel and or Ellie were looking at the view. Of course, this is a new game, and it may not be meant to showcase anything else than that whatever scene follows this one takes place within the settlement. Or it could be a cut-down scene where we see one or several characters looking at this view, just like in Part 1. Maybe Seraphites or another hostile faction scouting the area. I might be reading too far into it, but hey, this is a breakdown video after all. I'm trying to dig as much as I can. Moving on, in the two following shots we see the conversation we heard in the background in the previous one in person. Ellie and Dina both wear more everyday clothes than they did at the party we saw in 2018. They seem to be in some sort of abandoned building, considering the foliage growing on the walls in the background, as well as the general state of disrepair the building seems to be in. Maybe somewhere in the outskirts of Jackson, or even outside the walls. I mean, considering how thriving and well-maintained the rest of the town seems to be, as we'll see in a bit, I doubt that this place is anywhere close to the populated areas of the settlement, at least. Maybe they're hiding from or avoiding duties, chores, or even the judgment of other Jackson inhabitants for some alone time. Or they just wanted to try out some weed, considering Dina is holding a blunt. Weed confirmed as a power-up in The Last of Us Part 2? Just kidding. Unless... Also, before we move on to the next shot, I thought I'd say that it seems as if Ellie has had a slight facial redesign since we saw her last. It may just be me, but it's not impossible. In fact, it happened during the development of Part 1. Go back and look at the different trailers and you'll notice a significant difference in appearance between them. In the following shot, we see Ellie and Dina walking through a thriving and bustling street of Jackson during wintertime. There is so much going on here that it's hard to break down, but I'll try. All of the decorative lights seem to suggest that this takes place around Christmas time. They also do look very similar to the ones we see at the party in the E3 demo. Maybe whatever makes Ellie embark on this journey goes down shortly after the party, and the gameplay we see in Seattle takes place during spring or summer the following year. Anyways, going back to the fact that there is so much going on. I mean, moving vehicles, dozens of NPCs walking around, the street practically being totally crowded, kind of leads me to believe that this Jackson section might all be a cutscene. Now, I'd love to be wrong about that, because it looks so damn cool, and I'd love to explore it. But just looking at the density of all that's happening, I don't know. I mean, it could still be a playable section of the game, like when Nate walks through the crowds in the town on Madagascar in Uncharted 4. But then again, that was little more than just walking through it. I hope I'm wrong though. We also see a sign that reads Copper Peak Inn, which may be where the party from the E3 demo takes place. Other than that, if we go back to the first shot overlooking Jackson, we can pinpoint exactly where this shot takes place, since we see this very distinctive church that is the only building of its kind in the town, which would be around here. I know there are tons of more small things in this shot, but I think I've covered the more significant ones. I'd rather leave the cool tiny details for a video focusing on just that. In the next shot, we see a close-up of the previous scene where Dina and Ellie are meeting up and heading somewhere. We get a closer look at one of the buildings. From this angle, we can deduce that it's a meat trader of some kind. The sign above it reads Nubuck Leather, or however you'd pronounce that. This only further indicates how well off Jackson is, or has become since part 1. It's a proper society, so much so that businesses like this trader have been popping up. No longer is it just a bunch of survivors holed up in a place trying to just survive. Sure, we did see traders in the Boston quarantine zone, and we have no idea how the cannibals of Lakeside lived. But considering the quarantine zone traders were literally cooking and selling rats, living in rickety shacks in an alleyway, and that the cannibals, well, resorted to cannibalism, I would hardly say that any of them were prospering. Now, what am I trying to say with all this? Well, it points toward a change in The Last of Us' universe as a whole. All the societies and factions in part 1 were just surviving, constantly warring with each other, stuck in misery, clinging to unreachable ideals, or content to just get what they want by killing anyone that enters their territory. This is a totally different tone. It genuinely looks like a nice place. A place that has begun to heal and rebuild since the outbreak. Of course, looks can deceive, and we know that part 2 is going to be a mainly dark game. But I thought it was an interesting detail in terms of the TLO universe as a whole. For the second thought, let's just assume that Jackson indeed is a more open and explorable area. What if this means that traders or vendors are going to be a gameplay mechanic in the game? It feels unlikely, but not impossible. It's not that much of a leap from collecting parts and upgrading your weapons at select locations. What's saying that there can't also be select locations along the linear journey where you can trade your supplies for maybe unique weapons or collectibles? Anyways, moving on. In this shot we see Jesse handing over 2 what seems to be hunting rifles, although this one looks slightly different from the first game, to Ellie and Dina, whilst commenting, "Look who decided to join us," probably indicating that they were late. Most likely due to the conversation they had back in that abandoned building. There's also this guy holding what seems to be an M1 carbine, or carbine? How do you say it? In the background. Which is a weapon we haven't seen in the previous trailers, or games for that matter. What interests me the most about this shot though is the massive walls and gate. Because if you rewind time and take a look at Jackson in part 1, the walls were way shorter and honestly just looked like they were the already existing pre-outbreak walls that you'd have in your backyard. In some places there were even old buses and cars used instead of walls. But now, a mere 5 years later, there are massive wooden walls, rivaling those of the Boston quarantine zone, surrounding the entire town. Only further adding to my previous points of Jackson actually prospering and rebuilding instead of just getting by. Other than that, we can see that the patrols we've known about since the E3 demo seem to be a decently sized operation, if we assume all the people in the background are part of it. There is not much to say about the following shot other than that it looks cool and certainly invokes a bit of nostalgia from The Last of Us Part 1, with the hunting rifle and all that. Following that shot is one where Ellie and Dina, as well as 2 unknown riders, have gotten on their horses, ready to head out. The gate they're at seems to be located in some sort of open ranch/stables area, which is weird to me since if we refer to the starting scene of the trailer, overlooking the entire settlement, there is no such area. The whole town seems to be very dense. It might just be that it's covered by some of the trees or buildings though. In the next shot, we see a total of 6 riders, 2 of which are Ellie and Dina. It's unclear whether or not Jesse is joining them, but judging by his dialogue, you know the drill, run your routes, mark your logbooks, you run into anything you can't handle, you come back. as well as how he talks about it in the E3 demo, referring to them as quote-unquote my patrols, it seems to me that Jesse is more of an organizer, the head of the Jackson Guard Force or whatever, but he may not actually go out himself. Now, the riders seem to all be going in different directions, but we see in the very next shot that Dina and Ellie are going together. Whether this was the plan or they just defied protocol to be together is also unclear. I'm also wondering about the purpose of these patrols. If they're meant to go one by one, it can't be to clear out potential threats. That just wouldn't be effective or safe. So I'm assuming that they're making sure everything around them is clear, scouting for potential threats that have to be dealt with, and maybe also scavenging for supplies. This theory is further supported by what Jesse says: run your routes, mark your logbooks, which most likely means they have a predetermined search area that they check every single time to watch for threats. Also, just another quick thought: since Jackson is this prosperous, and they have these rather small, not out in force patrols, I think they may have lived in either relative or complete peace for the last few years. Back in part 1, Tommy did say that they had problems with bandits, but if they're okay with sending people out on their own, I doubt that there could still be big gangs of them in close proximity, like we see in part 1. Moving on, we see the shot of Ellie and Dina riding through an old suburban area that I mentioned earlier. Not much to say here other than that the tone in the background music drastically changes to a more dark and ominous style.
Mark your logbooks.
Which is appropriate since the very next scene is one of a dead, completely ripped apart moose. Now, unless the Seraphites or some other faction are just so crazy that they'd kill and rip apart a moose and not use it, despite the scarcity of resources in the apocalypse, I'd say it was most likely killed by infected. Sure, it could also be any regular predator, but judging by all the human-looking footprints in the nearby snow, I doubt it. Following that scene, we see Ellie slowly walking towards a spore-infested area, presumably in one of the abandoned houses in the very same suburban town we saw moments ago. What's most interesting about this one, though, is that Ellie is wearing a mask? Wait, what? I thought she was immune. Well, she most likely still is. The reason she's wearing her mask here is probably to keep up appearances. As Joel said in part 1, it wouldn't be a good idea admitting you're infected to everyone. Though I must say it seems highly unlikely she's managed to hide the bite for 5 entire years. Sure, the tattoo visually covers it up. But didn't anyone ever grab her arm or bumped into it and accidentally felt all the bumps of the fungus and bite scars? Anyways, more on the whole mask thing later. The next scene shows Ellie reaching for Dina's hand, presumably to help her get over the hole in the floor, but as she does, it gives in and they both fall through into what seems to be a basement. Not much else to comment on other than that we get a better shot of Ellie's mask, which looks way different in comparison to the part 1 gas mask. I'd say it almost looks like a diver's mask. Oh, and neither of them have their rifles here. Now, that might just be like part 1, where weapons didn't show up in cutscenes. Or, it may be hinting at something similar to Red Dead 2. Maybe they had to leave the rifles at the horses because they had not yet created a second holster for them? Anyways, after they fall through the floor, the screen fades to black, and we hear the creepy and familiar sound of a clicker. Which is exactly what we see in the next shot. We see Dina lying on the floor, indicating that this is right after the fall, pointing her 9mm pistol towards the clicker. Now, I may just be looking too far into this, but this doesn't look like the clickers from part 1. It looks way more monsterish. It doesn't have any clothes on, at least as far as I can see, and its skin is almost completely overgrown with fungus, like a bloater, but in clicker form. Of course, this could just be part of the updated design of the clickers in part 2, and that lore-wise it's the same as in part 1. Or it could be something else. It's hard to tell. Also, the way this shot is angled with the camera behind Dina like this, it begs the question, Is Dina playable? We do know that there will be multiple playable characters, but is she one of them? Moving on, the following scene is an aerial shot of Ellie and Dina riding through the forest as the snowing picks up. It's hard to tell whether or not it takes place before or after the clicker encounter. Naughty Dog are infamous to arrange scenes in their trailers to mislead, after all, but the fact that the weather changed leads me to believe that it in fact does take place after the clicker. In the next two shots, the snowing has turned into a full-on blizzard, forcing Ellie to put her hood on. It's hard to see anything at all other than that it seems to take place in the same general area as before. The difference being that now she and Dina have apparently become separated by some unknown event or for some unknown reason. The following shot is more interesting, I'd say, as we see Ellie slowly approaching an inhabited cabin. It's darker outside, indicating that this takes place later that same day. Note that she does have her rifle here, unlike at the clicker encounter. In the next scene she has entered the cabin, which, if I may just go off topic for a second, really reminds me of the ski lodge in the second season of Telltale's The Walking Dead. Anyways, we see no signs of anyone, despite the fact that it's obviously inhabited. Now, this may be because whoever uses it is not there at the moment, or because they're hiding, waiting for Ellie to run into them. The second option being the far more likely one considering what happens next. She walks down the stairs towards the basement where ominously there's a pool of blood outside the door. Shortly thereafter she walks in, and judging by her expression and gasp, she sees something that surprises her. Now, the trailer has only been out for a few hours, but I've already seen a lot of debate regarding what she actually saw. The most obvious thing would of course be Dina. Yeah, she and Dina go out on patrol together, Dina goes missing, Ellie looks for her, and bam, she finds her in the basement. But considering what happens next, I'm not at all so sure. Just after seeing whatever was inside that basement, Ellie lunges forward, pointing her gun towards something or someone, but is ambushed by a man and then held down by the same man and another one we don't get to see the face of. She tells them to get off of her and then pleads for them to stop, which is very unlike her. Whatever they were doing is then followed by a loud gunshot and Ellie desperately screaming no. No! So, what happened? Did she go into the room only to see Dina captured by whoever these people are, then try to save her, only for them to then shoot her? Forgive me, but it doesn't make sense to me. Firstly, if their intention was just to kill her, why would they capture her in the first place? Why not just shoot her outright, in the open? Sure, maybe they wanted information and once they got it, they killed her. But why do it like that, in front of Ellie? It's hardly like they'd get any information out of her by killing Dina. And if they just killed Dina, why wouldn't they kill Ellie too? It's just too weird for me. And of course, we don't get to see any of it. It's all intentional. It's specifically set up for us to go crazy speculating about it. And Naughty Dog have also outright admitted, as I previously mentioned, that they rearrange in-game footage and cutscenes in trailers as to mislead people. One of my favorite examples of this being when they made it look like Ellie actually pointed the gun at Joel in the scene where she saves him from the hunter that tried to drown him in one of the Part 1 trailers. I can't be sure this isn't Dina getting killed, but it's just way too obvious and weird for me. Also, why reveal a major character death in a trailer? No. Anyways, I wanted to talk a bit more about the people that ambushed and held Ellie down. Are they Seraphites? No. Why? Because neither of them are wearing their uniform, the big brown coat we've seen in previous trailers, which we'll also see later in this trailer. And the man which face we can see does not appear to be shaved/bald, and neither does he have the quote-unquote angel wing scars that all of the other Seraphites have on their cheeks. So, is this a brand new faction? They don't seem to be wearing any specific uniform, so is it just some bandits or hunters, or maybe even regular survivors then? Well, there weren't that many enemies in Part 1 that weren't part of some bigger faction. I don't know. We do see more people with more regular clothing similar to these guys later in the trailer fighting Ellie. So maybe they are part of the same faction. Also, it'd be kinda weird that whatever bad thing happened here is just caused by two random guys, which makes it all the more likely that they're part of this new unknown faction. Moving on, in the next shot we see Ellie presumably back home in Jackson. She's sitting on a bed or sofa, all her wounds and bruises exposed. Somehow she made it out of the basement and back home. Not much else to say about the scene really, other than that this is probably the moment when she decides to go on this journey. In the next shot, we see a familiar and welcome sight. Tommy, rocking a very similar outfit to the one he had in the first game, shows up at Ellie's door. Carrying a box of probably food? He looks a bit roughed up with a bloody wound on his forehead, but I'll come back to that in a bit. In the following two shots we see Ellie pack her bag and check the string of her bow as she tells Tommy she has to, quote-unquote, finish it. Now it should be noted that the scene where she holds her bow, she's wearing her summer clothing, which we saw in the E3 demo. And she seems to be in a completely different location than the one where she's packing her backpack. We can't see if she's wearing Dina's bracelet in the bag shot, but she is wearing it in the one with the bow. But if the Dina died in the basement theory is true, then she should be wearing it in the bag shot too. Unless she gets it back whilst seeking revenge later. Now the shot that follows those two is probably my favorite in the entire trailer. It's just absolutely beautiful. We see the deteriorating skyline of what I assume is Seattle. I'll have to confirm that later, and probably do an updated locations of part 2 video. Now, two things come to mind when I see this scene. One is obviously how very open it is. We've previously heard from Naughty Dog and seen in the E3 2018 demo that the levels of part 2 will be more ambitious and open than the previous game. I wonder just how open though. The Lost Legacy open? Now that would be amazing. Imagine having that entire, what I assume is the downtown area, explorable. The other thing that came to mind is, if this is downtown Seattle, even if it isn't, it looks to be a densely populated area. Why isn't it more destroyed? We learned in part 1 that the Air Force carpet bombed the major cities to kill off as many infected as possible during the outbreak. But if you compare Boston and this place, it seems like this area got off with barely a scratch. Of course, it's possible that we just don't see the destruction from this angle, or that the carpet bombings ceased before they could get to Seattle. Now, back to Tommy. In the next shot, we see him sitting down in Ellie's home, telling her that she has no idea what she's walking into. Now, I mentioned that he looked roughed up, and I think this is because he actually had a run-in with whatever group they're talking about. What if the two men that assaulted Ellie in the basement actually are a part of this group, and once Tommy learned of what happened, he and a bunch of other Jackson people went out to deal with this new threat. As I said earlier when talking about the patrols, they were out to look for potential threats that needed a larger force to deal with. And well, this was probably a threat they deemed to be great enough. So they went out and Tommy got wounded in the process. Maybe they were defeated whilst fighting them and had to retreat, in turn making Tommy try to stop Ellie from going after them because of what he experienced. Or something along those lines. To which Ellie obviously responds,
"What are you doing?"
I mean, would it really be Ellie if she didn't protest people trying to stop her from doing things? Anyways, in the next shot we see another really cool scene of what probably is Seattle. And maybe the replacement for the pallet puzzles in the first game? Probably not that likely. I'm sure Ellie can swim by the time of part 2. But this boat and other quote-unquote vehicles like horses is just further indication of the open areas we've heard about. I mean, what would be the point of including a boat just for a tiny section of linear water? Of course, there's always a possibility that it's a cutscene, but I'd like to think it's not. Maybe it's like that first level in Metro Exodus, where you have a swampy area that has tons of locations that can only be reached by boat. Following that is a scene in what seems to be an old subway station, where we see 3 masked people presumably searching the area. The scene is so dimly lit that even brightening it up in Photoshop doesn't do much. All I can tell about these people is that they most likely aren't Seraphites. Now I can't confirm it because we can't see their faces, but they aren't wearing the brown coats. They also seem to be heavily armed, which from what we've seen so far of the Seraphites, isn't like them. I can't exclude the possibility that they may be Fedra or Fireflies, but it seems more likely that this is the other unknown group that Tommy is talking about, and that the men who assaulted Ellie may be part of. The next shot is of two unknown characters in some sort of makeshift interrogation room. The one who's doing the interrogation or torture seems to be wearing some sort of uniform, but it's still similar to the clothing the men in the basement had. Brightening up the image doesn't do much, I'm afraid. I tried to see if the man being interrogated was a Seraphite by looking for scars, but it's impossible to see because of the blood covering his cheeks, and then later the man grabbing his face. Now, this is certainly very interesting because neither of these characters are ones we've seen before. Is one of them, or both of them, additional major characters? Or is Ellie or Joel directly involved in this scene somehow, and that's why we get to see it? A lot of questions. The following two shots look very familiar, almost as if taken directly from the E3 gameplay. The environment looks very similar, and like in the demo, Ellie gets hit by an arrow. I tried looking through the gameplay again to see if this scene is actually from the exact same area, but I couldn't determine if it was. It's very likely though. The fact that we have to manually pull out arrows that hit us is a mechanic we already knew about from E3 as well, so not a lot to discuss here really. After that, we definitely have a more interesting scene though. We see Ellie standing up, holding out her hand, shaking just like in that very first trailer almost 3 years ago now. Now, a lot of people have theorized that this is because her infection is somehow getting worse. I don't personally subscribe to that opinion, but I can't disprove it either, so I won't try to. I believe, especially as we hear her say, "You can't stop this" in the background, and the fact that this journey is probably such a massive undertaking that she's simply nervous or just have been through something horrible. Just like Ashley Johnson said herself in the first PSX 2016 panel. She's been through some shit. Moving on, the next scene is a very quick one of Ellie stabbing a Seraphite in the throat with her switchblade, in what again seems to be the same general area of the E3 gameplay demo. Not much to say about it other than that it looks cool and that the environment is beautiful. Following that short scene is one where we get our first look at some nasty Part 2 shotgun dismemberment, as Ellie shoots a woman wielding a machete, wearing clothes similar to the previous unknown enemies, in the face. Again, not a whole lot to dissect here, other than that the shotgun and dismemberment will return, but we knew that already. Yet another very short scene comes after that one, where we get to see Ellie slicing up another woman, again in similar clothing, with her switchblade, which confirms that it's not just for stealth takedowns. But it was like that in the Ellie sections of Part 1 too, so I don't think that's too much of a surprise. After that, we get another scene of close quarters combat where Ellie disarms yet another person, this time a man, again wearing similar clothing to the previous unknown enemies. Now, we already knew that hatchets and disarming would be in the game from the E3 demo. Still, it's cool to get another shot of it. The next few shots is the first we see of what presumably is what Neil meant when he said that they were expanding on the infected. This, whatever it is not something we've seen before. It may look like a bloater with a quick glance, but if you look closer, it's got a completely different shape. It's asymmetrical, with a weird overgrowth on one side of its body, while the other side seems fairly untouched by the fungus. Now, bloaters are completely covered in fungus armor, and have the spore bombs that they throw at us attached all over. And neither of these two facts fit these new types of infected. I.e., that's why they're new. To be fair, this first shot where this infected breaks through this shelving unit or whatever it is, which also is an interesting new mechanic, that the infected can affect the environment is so hard to see that I can't confirm if it's a bloater or one of these new ones, or yet another new one. I'm not the biggest fan of them adding new infected to the game, but that's a topic for another video. Anyways, the environment and lighting in these infected shots is very similar to the subway shot we saw earlier. Aside from that first one, it's all underground and lit by burning flares. Now, I don't think this necessarily means that these scenes are one and the same. Where Ellie fights two of these new infected seems to be more of a basement or a warehouse type of room rather than a subway tunnel. My bet is that the flare is a new item that's usable by both NPCs and the player, that provides light in very dark areas, but also does something to the infected. Perhaps it lures them out of their hiding places? Maybe it enrages them or makes them weaker? It's hard to tell. The last very interesting thing in this shot is that Ellie still wears her mask. Now, we don't know if anyone else is with her. Still, even if there was, it just seems like an unnecessary inconvenience. But let's, for the discussion's sake, assume that she is in fact alone. Why would she wear the mask? Now, of course we could go back to that the infection is actually affecting her theory, but what would be the point in protecting herself from it then anyways? The fireflies tell us that the fungus has already grown all over her brain, so what's the use in avoiding a few more spores? Well, another potential reason could be that Ellie is actually the one that's pregnant in part 2, and that she's unsure if the baby is immune too. Now, this was a popular theory way back in 2016 when we first saw that pregnant woman that sort of resembled Ellie on the Last of Us American Daughters poster in Uncharted 4 wearing a gas mask. Now, I'm not too sure about that one, but we can't exclude it. Finally, maybe these new types of infected emit something else, or only hole up in areas that are toxic and requires a gas mask to protect against. Maybe that's the whole reason for their existence in the first place. Some infected came into contact with some sort of chemical local to this area of the US and mutated, which is why we haven't seen them anywhere else. No way of knowing, but certainly fun to think about. Anyways, moving on, we have a very quick shot of a Seraphite heavy class enemy destroying a door as Ellie is about to pass through it. Not much to say about it other than that it again seems to be in the same general area and time of day of the E3 demo, as well as letting us know that the destructible environments translate the doors as well. Of course, it could also just be a scripted event or cutscene too. The following scene is also very short, but not any less interesting. Ellie is attacked by a guard dog in some sort of underground facility. I guess we finally got our answer as to what that dog was doing on the set of the motion capture. Of course, it's still possible that we'll have a dog as a companion at some point, but now we at least know that guard dogs will be a new enemy class. I'd suspect that they'll require us to be even more stealthy than around clickers if we don't want to get spotted. The other intriguing thing about this scene is the location. It's obviously inhabited, or at least used by someone, and it's important enough to warrant a guard dog. First, I thought this was the same location as the interrogation scene earlier in the trailer, but we can make out that it's not. The lamp in the room in the background is in the ceiling here, and the one in the interrogation room was laying on a small counter of sorts. The interrogation room was also an old bathroom, and this, while hard to see, doesn't look like it is a bathroom. My guess is that Ellie is deep in some sort of outpost or compound, most likely belonging to this new unknown faction looking for something. But there really isn't anything else pointing towards this other than the dog and the electric light, which I'd say are two things that feels like the Seraphites wouldn't use. Moving on, in the next shot we get our first look at some runners in all new Part 2 style graphics, as well as one of those nasty exploding headshots. Worth noting here is that one of the infected in the background appears to be a clicker. This one, however, is wearing clothes, unlike the weird one during the winter section with Dina. Also, in this shot, Ellie is not wearing her gas mask. Now, it could just be that this area is not infested with spores, but if we look here, it certainly does look like it is. So why is she not wearing her mask here? And why is she wearing it in the earlier shots? I've already gone over some ideas earlier, so I won't go over them here again. Maybe I'll go more in depth into this in another video. Now, in this next scene, we see two more enemies that look very similar to the other unknown people Ellie has fought earlier in the trailer. Though I have to point out that these, at least the man in the front, has a slightly more military look to him. He's wearing cargo pants and what looks to be some sort of military cap. But he certainly doesn't look like someone from Fedra, unless they've massively changed their uniforms. My guess is that these guys belong to the same faction Tommy is talking about, and that we see Ellie fight throughout the trailer, and that they are some sort of heavily armed militia-style faction. If it indeed was the Fireflies or Fedra, Tommy would have said so, because he is familiar with both. Of course, he could have, and Naughty Dog just cut that out of the trailer, but the fact still remains that they look like neither. Anyways, shortly after we see this guy, he meets a gory end to what's probably a nail bomb either placed down or thrown by Ellie, after which we move on to the next shot. Now, second to last scene in the trailer. We see Ellie sitting in the front passenger seat of a car, and she gets grabbed by a runner through the window. Now, the surrounding area does not seem to be downtown Seattle, rather some sort of suburban area, which almost reminds me of Bill's Town, what with the car and all. Anyways, we can see that the hood of the car is fairly roughed up. Not massively though, so whether or not it's crashed is hard to tell. Also, who else is in the car with Ellie? Joel? And will we be able to drive the car? I mean, with the open environments we've already talked about and the other vehicles/mounts, like the boat and the horse, a car wouldn't be all that unlikely, would it? Alright, now for everybody's favorite part of the trailer. We see Ellie in the same or a very similar suburban area as the previous shot of the car. She seems to be in some sort of alleyway overlooking a burning truck. Then, someone grabs her and holds their hand over her mouth, and in the background we see two military vehicles roll past. One Humvee, identical to the ones from the previous games, and one that I can't quite make out what it is. Now, I admit that I had a bit of a fangirl moment when I saw this the first time, which you can see in my live reaction if you're interested. Why? Because I immediately jumped to the conclusion that this has to be Fedra, which happens to be my favorite faction alongside the Fireflies. But now, with the initial excitement gone and the adrenaline out of my blood, I'd say that it's more likely that these vehicles belong to the unknown, heavily armed faction we've talked about throughout this breakdown. We've seen other factions use military vehicles before, like the Hunters in Pittsburgh. And while we didn't directly see it, the Fireflies also definitely had access to them too. So the fact that we see military vehicles does not mean it's Fedra. Though since Neil did confirm back in 2017 that they'd be in the game in one form or another, I'm holding out hope anyways. A few moments later, whoever grabbed Ellie lets her go. We see her turn around to face them and immediately take on a look of confusion as she says, "What the hell are you doing here?" Now, I think we all knew who it was at this point. And just a second later, we see the man himself. The thing we've been patiently waiting to see for almost 3 years at this point. Joel. He looks quite different from what we're used to from part 1, but I honestly don't mind. I think he looks as awesome as ever. There's not much else to say about his appearance though. His clothes look similar to the ones from part 1, but it's hard to tell if they're the same or not. What's more interesting is what he says, which was probably the most Joel thing they could have made him say. "You think I'd let you do this on your own?" But I'll go more into that in just a moment when we talk about the general story stuff. Anyways, that was it for the shot-by-shot breakdown. Now, let's just quickly go over some thoughts and theories I have on what we can learn about the storyline in general from this trailer. Now, bear in mind, I'm writing the script for and finishing this video less than 24 hours after the release date trailer dropped. Neither I nor the general community have had much time to think about and come up with well thought through theories. So if you're watching this in the future, please keep that in the back of your head. Alright, so the winter sequence that starts off the trailer is obviously taking place before all of this with the Seraphites and the new unknown faction, and is probably the start of the game. It's more than likely showing the end of the normal life Ellie's been living in Jackson for the past 5 years. We get to follow Ellie in her duties and routines up until the point where something goes wrong during her and Dina's patrol and they get separated. Instead of going back like instructed, Ellie looks for Dina as the weather gets worse and it starts to get dark. Eventually she finds this cabin that she thinks is where Dina is. She heads in, down to the basement, and is surprised by whatever goes on in there and tries to stop it. but is ambushed by a member of a new faction we haven't seen before. Held down, beaten up, and forced to watch whatever she tried to stop happen anyways. One way or another, she later breaks free and manages to make her way back to Jackson, where she alerts Tommy and the other Jackson leadership of what happened. In response to this, Tommy goes out in force to either deal with this threat or to find Dina, or both, but ends up being ambushed and wounded by the same faction that attacked Ellie, and forced to retreat back to Jackson. Realizing Ellie is going out for revenge for whatever happened, he goes to her house to try and convince her to not, since whatever experience he got from encountering this new faction gave him a real bad impression of them. Ellie, being Ellie of course, gets mad and tells him that he can't stop her, insisting that she has to finish it, whatever it is, and starts to make her way towards Seattle alone. Tommy of course notifies Joel of this, and he immediately sets out after her. After a few months, in either late spring or early summer, Ellie arrives in Seattle, and finds herself in a town infested with all kinds of foes. Infected she's never seen before. A religious cult going by the name of the Seraphites, as well as the faction that ambushed her way back in Wyoming, which turns out to be some kind of heavily armed militia, all busy warring against each other. Ellie gets caught up in all this as she seeks out revenge for whatever happened during winter. One day, whilst hiding in an alleyway from a convoy of vehicles from the heavily armed militia, someone grabs her from behind, pulling her away from the line of sight. As she turns around, she sees that Joel has finally caught up with her, and from there on out, they continue the journey together. So that's a very basic storyline from what I can gather from this new trailer. It's not much, and I don't think it's going to be all that accurate at all, but at least it's fun to think about. Also, even though this is an idea of what might happen chronologically, it does not necessarily mean that we play it that way. It could be 2 or more parallel timelines similar to Uncharted 4, for example, which has been hinted at earlier. Anyways, those are just my thoughts and theories for this trailer. I know this was a very long video, but there was just so much to talk about. What do you think? Do you agree with my points? Disagree? Do you think I missed anything, or that I'm wrong about something that I pointed out? Be sure to tell me in the comments down below and let's discuss it. And until next time, have a great day.